something that's, kind of bitchy.
Pretty bitchy.
Bitchy? I know.
It's just, bitchy.
Well, first of all, you're a little bitchy. That's next level bitchy.
Welcome to Bitchy History, the irreverent history podcast where one history professor gets to bitch about history and the impact it has on the world today. Welcome back to Bitchy History, where we untangle the messy threads of the past to figure out why our present is such a hot mess. Today's episode is about the Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA, a simple, one-sentence proposal that somehow managed to spark one of the biggest cultural wars in American history. What's wild about the ERA is how straightforward it is. It literally just said, men and women shall have equal rights throughout the United States and every place subject to its jurisdiction. At least that's the original version. It's had some edits since then, but we'll get to that. That's it, just 24 words. No asterisks, no fine print, no wiggle room. Rarely have I seen anything so straightforward in any government legislation. You try reading a congressional bill sometime. I guarantee you're going to need a bottle of whiskey. So with how simple it was and how foundational the concept of equality is supposed to be in American history, you'd think this would have been an easy win, right? Wrong. Instead, the ERA became a battleground for competing visions of what America should look like. On one side, you had feminists like Alice Paul, Betty Friedan, and Gloria Steinem fighting for legal equality. On the other, you had conservative activists like Phyllis Schlafly claiming the ERA would destroy the family, force women into combat, and, heaven forbid, create unisex bathrooms. Yes, this is the story of a country that couldn't handle the idea of gender equality, and one woman who made it her life's mission to keep things that way. But before we get into what is arguably one of my favorite activities, ripping Phyllis Schlafly a new one, let's rewind to where this story begins, the suffragist movement of the early 20th century. To really understand the ERA, you have to understand Alice Paul, the suffragist who wrote it. Alice Paul was, in a word, unstoppable. Born in 1885 to a Quaker family, she grew up believing in equality, activism, and the power of direct action. By the time she hit her 30s, she had already been arrested multiple times for leading suffrage protests and hunger strikes in both the US and the UK. After the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, Paul looked at the state of women's rights and said, cool, we can vote now, but what about everything else? She realized that suffrage wasn't enough. Without full legal equality, women would always face systemic barriers. That's why she wrote the Equal Rights Amendment in 1923. Originally titled the Lucretia Mott Amendment, the ERA was introduced to Congress in 1923 during the 75th anniversary of the Seneca Falls Convention. Paul's goal was clear: to make gender equality a constitutional guarantee. On the ERA, Alice Paul had this to say: "We shall not be safe until the principle of equal rights is written into the framework of our government, and I never doubted that equal rights was the right direction. Most reforms, most problems are complicated, but to me, there is nothing complicated about ordinary equality." Hell yeah, that makes complete sense to me. Unfortunately, we are now living in a hellscape where grown men say things like, "Your body, my choice," and advocate for repealing the very amendment Alice Paul and so many others fought for. But I digress. Let's get back to the 1920s. America during this era was not exactly an equality-loving utopia. I'm pretty sure you know that already, but I'm gonna reiterate it. The Roaring Twenties may have brought flapper dresses and women dancing in speakeasies, but the cultural shift stopped short, far short, of endorsing any systemic change. This is a topic I've discussed in previous episodes of the show. Even some women's groups opposed the ERA, just as some of them had opposed the 19th Amendment before it. Labor feminists, for example, argued that it would erase workplace protections like shorter hours for women and maternity benefits. To them, the ERA felt like a step backward, a threat to hard-won gains for working women. Meanwhile, Congress basically ignored the amendment. They let it gather dust for decades. Alice Paul and the National Women's Party kept pushing it, but it was like yelling into a void. Progress stalled, and Paul spent the next few decades watching the ERA languish in obscurity. It wasn't until the 1960s, when second-wave feminism burst onto the scene, that the ERA got its second chance. By the 1960s, feminism was back, and this time it was louder, it was angrier, and it was ready to take on the patriarchy. This era gave us the National Organization for Women, the groundbreaking Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan, and the unforgettable demonstrations outside the Miss America pageant in 1968. Which, by the way, did not involve bra burning, but that's a topic for another episode. The second wave wasn't just about getting women into the voting booth, it was about challenging the entire system. Women were demanding equality in the workplace, in education, and under the law. The ERA fit perfectly into this movement. In 1970, Now launched a massive campaign to revive the ERA. Feminist leaders like Gloria Steinem and Shirley Chisholm gave impassioned speeches arguing that equality shouldn't be a radical idea. It should be the bare minimum. In a speech she gave before Congress, Shirley Chisholm had this to say: "It is time we act to assure full equality of opportunity to those citizens who, although in majority, suffer the restrictions that are commonly imposed on minorities, to women. The argument that this amendment will not solve the problem of sex discrimination is not relevant. If the argument were used against the Civil Rights Bill, as it has been used in the past, the prejudice that lies behind it would be embarrassing. Of course, laws will not eliminate prejudice from the hearts of human beings, but that is no reason to allow prejudice to continue to be enshrined in our laws, to perpetuate injustice through inaction. The time is clearly now to put this House on record for the fullest expression of that equality of opportunity which our founding fathers professed. They professed it, but they did not assure it to their daughters as they tried to do for their sons. The Constitution they wrote was designed to protect the rights of white male citizens. As there were no black founding fathers, there were no founding mothers. A great pity on both counts. It is not too late to complete the work they left undone. Today, here, we should start in doing so." In 1972, Congress finally passed the ERA with overwhelming bipartisan support. The amendment, however, still needed to be ratified by 38 states. At this point, the ERA had been changed somewhat, and it now read, Section 1. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. Section 2. The Congress shall have the power to enforce, by appropriate legislation, the provisions of this article. Section 3. This amendment shall take effect 2 years after the date of ratification. At first, it seemed like a slam dunk. It had bipartisan support in Congress. 30 states ratified it within the first year. Feminists were celebrating. It felt like the tide was turning. By 1973, feminists were riding high on optimism. The ERA seemed like it was a done deal, and the momentum of women's movements was unstoppable. And then came the backlash, and it came in the form of one really annoying woman, or as I see her, demon spawn, Phyllis Schlafly. Now let's talk about the woman who single-handedly turned the ERA from a near certainty into one of America's most bitterly contested battlegrounds. If Alice Paul is the hero of our story, Schlafly is unequivocally its villain. Hey, you didn't come here for my unbiased and dispassionate telling of history. You know what you're getting. Born in 1924 in St. Louis, Missouri, Schlafly grew up during the Great Depression in a conservative Catholic family. She was brilliant. She graduated near the top of her class at Washington University, earned a master's in government from Radcliffe College, and later attended law school at Washington University while raising 6 kids. Yes, 6. She was ambitious, she was articulate, and she was unapologetically conservative. By the 1950s and 1960s, Schlafly had already made a name for herself in right-wing circles. She wrote books, campaigned for Barry Goldwater, and railed against the Soviet Union. But it wasn't until 1972, when she launched the Stop ERA campaign, that Schlafly truly became a household name. And what does Stop ERA stand for, you ask? Oh, it's Stop Taking Our Privileges. Yeah. Schlafly argued that gender inequality was a privilege for women.
We find, as we look into the matter, that ERA won't give women anything which they haven't already got or have a way of getting. But on the other hand, it will take away from women some of the most important rights and benefits and exemptions we now have.
Yeah. To quote John Mulaney, we don't have time to unpack all of that, but let's just keep going. Schlafly's campaign was built on fear, especially the fear that the ERA would destroy everything good and holy about American family life. She claimed the amendment would do 3 things specifically, but there were a multitude of others. 1, force women into the military draft. Technically this was true, but really, let's think about it. The argument here was end the draft, right? 2, eliminate alimony and child custody preferences for mothers. Well, it turns out that men don't fight for custody of their kids anyway, and they don't pay alimony when you tell them to anyway, so it's not a big change, really. And 3, create unisex bathrooms, which would allow predators a hunting ground. Whew, that one sounds familiar. Now let's be clear, none of this was in the ERA's text. I've already read the ERA's text to you. It was fear-mongering, pure and simple, but fear works, and Schlafly knew it, just as her ideological descendants at Fox News and the Trump campaign know it. Schlafly wasn't just a master manipulator of rhetoric, she was a savvy organizer. She mobilized an army of conservative women, many of them homemakers, who felt threatened by the rapid changes of the 1960s and 70s. The women, unlike the National Organization for Women, were obsessed with being perceived as traditional housewives. Think of it like the 1970s version of tradwives on TikTok. They encouraged women with children to bring them to the rallies to show off being a mother, and delivered gifts of homemade bread, pies, and jams to state legislators in order to emphasize women's traditional roles. I was going to make a pun here about bread rolls, but I feel like that's insensitive. Let's move on. Schlafly's rhetoric wasn't just about the ERA, though. It was a direct assault on the feminist movement as a whole. She painted feminists as radicals who hated men, despised marriage, and wanted to dismantle society as we know it. In fact, in 2014, she was still trotting out that line and published a book titled Who Killed the American Family? And I'll give you one guess who she blamed. Unfortunately, her strategy worked. By 1977, Schlafly's campaign had successfully slowed the ERA's momentum. Ratification stalled at 35 states, 3 short of the 38 that they needed. The 1977 National Women's Conference in Houston, which brought together 2,000 delegates representing every state to discuss everything from pay equity to reproductive rights, was meant to rally support for the ERA, and it became a flashpoint for conservative backlash. Schlafly and her allies framed the conference as a gathering of radical feminists pushing an anti-family agenda, with Schlafly calling it the federal financing of a foolish festival for frustrated feminists. I bet she worked all night on that alliteration. Schlafly held a counter-rally of 15,000 pro-family supporters who met up only a few miles away from the conference and spoke about the evils of abortion, lesbian rights, and the Equal Rights Amendment. It always makes me feel all warm and fuzzy inside that Phyllis Schlafly would have specifically hated me for so many reasons. Schlafly's ability to frame the ERA as a threat to traditional American values resonated deeply with conservatives, particularly in the South and Midwest, like that's new. She turned the ERA into a litmus test for cultural conservatism, linking it to issues like abortion, LGBTQ+ rights, and even communism. Meanwhile, the Republican Party, which had supported the ERA since the 1940s, began to shift rightward. By 1980, the GOP officially dropped its support from the ERA from its platform. The ERA became a casualty of the culture wars. Schlafly's Stop ERA campaign wasn't just effective, it was transformative. Her rhetoric didn't just stall the ERA, it shifted the entire national conversation. The amendment, which started as a bipartisan call for equality, became a polarizing symbol of the culture wars, and Schlafly was just getting started. The Democratic Party, meanwhile, remained officially supportive of the ERA, but its efforts to push for ratification were hampered by internal divisions and political realities. By the time Jimmy Carter left office in 1981, the amendment's momentum had all but disappeared. While the national conversation about the ERA played out on TV screens and newspapers, the real battles were happening in state legislatures. Feminists worked tirelessly to persuade lawmakers in the remaining states to ratify the amendment, but they faced an uphill battle. Schlafly's grassroots network was relentless. Stop ERA activists flooded state capitals with letters, phone calls, and personal visits. They framed their opposition in moral terms, arguing that the ERA was an attack on traditional values and the American way of life. In some states, lawmakers who initially supported the ERA began to waver under the pressure from conservative constituents. In others, the amendment faced outright hostility. Congress had originally set a deadline of March 22, 1979 for the ERA to be ratified. As the deadline approached, it became clear that the amendment wasn't going to reach the required 38 states. As a result, feminists lobbied Congress to extend the deadline, and in 1978 they succeeded. The new deadline was June 30th, 1982. The extension gave ERA supporters a glimmer of hope, but it wasn't enough. Schlafly and her allies doubled down, and no additional states ratified the amendment before the new deadline. On June 30th, 1982, the ERA's ratification period officially expired. For feminists, it was a devastating blow. For Schlafly, it was a triumph. Honestly, the look of mean-spirited glee in her eyes when she's giving speeches celebrating the failure is, well, it's really something. That woman was not of God. Schlafly celebrated with her supporters, declaring victory for the traditional family. Feminists, meanwhile, vowed to keep fighting, but the momentum of the 1970s had burned out. The expiration of the ERA's deadline marked the end of an era. Pun intended. You have no idea how many the Eras Tour jokes I have restrained myself from putting in this episode. But the story of the ERA wasn't over, not by a long shot. In the decades that followed, the amendment would see a resurgence in support, proving that the fight for equality is never truly done until it's done. For decades after the 1982 deadline, the Equal Rights Amendment was treated like a relic of a bygone era, a feminist dream that had come tantalizingly close to reality but ultimately failed. For many, it seemed like the fight was over, but the ERA, much like its supporters, refused to fade quietly into the night. Fast forward to the 2010s, when a new wave of activism breathed life back into the movement. Fueled by a new generation of feminists, the Me Too movement, and a growing public awareness of gender inequality, the ERA re-entered the national conversation. The revival began truly in 2017, when Nevada became the first state in 35 years to ratify the ERA. What made Nevada's ratification so significant wasn't just the number, it was the timing. By 2017, the cultural landscape had shifted dramatically since the ERA's push in the 1970s. The Me Too movement was exposing systemic sexism in workplaces, politics, and Hollywood. Women were marching in the streets demanding justice and equality once more. Nevada's ratification felt like a direct response to this cultural moment. Inspired by Nevada's action, Illinois ratified the ERA in 2018, becoming the 37th state to do so. By this point, ERA supporters were building serious momentum once more. They needed just one more state to reach the magic number of 38. The final push came in 2020 when Virginia ratified the ERA, officially bringing the total to 38 states.
Ayes 59, nays 41, abstention 0. For the women of Virginia and the women of America, the resolution has finally passed.
This was a huge victory, a long-awaited culmination of decades of activism, but there was just one problem. The deadline. You know, the deadline, the technicality that has kept the ERA in legal and political limbo ever since. Congress had set a ratification deadline of 1979, later extended to 1982. By the time Nevada, Illinois, and Virginia ratified the ERA, that deadline had been expired for nearly 40 years. That raised a big question. Can Congress retroactively remove a deadline for a constitutional amendment? Proponents argued that yes, it absolutely could. They pointed to the 27th Amendment, which had no deadline and took over 200 years to be ratified. If Congress could certify that amendment, why not the ERA? They make up their own rules anyway all the time. Opponents, however, claimed that the ERA's deadline was binding and that any ratifications after 1982 were invalid. Adding to the mess, 5 states, Idaho, Kentucky, Nebraska, South Dakota, and Tennessee, had rescinded their earlier ratifications. In response to these legal challenges, ERA supporters in Congress introduced resolutions to remove the deadline. In 2020, the House of Representatives actually passed a resolution to eliminate the time limit, but it stalled in the Senate. The Biden administration has been supportive of the ERA, with the Department of Justice arguing that the deadline should not prevent its ratification, but without clear legal or legislative action, the ERA remains in limbo. Meanwhile, public support for the ERA has grown. Polls show that a majority of Americans across political lines support adding gender equality to the Constitution. This growing support is a testament to the changing cultural landscape in America. Issues like pay equity, reproductive rights, and LGBTQ+ protections have made the ERA more relevant than ever. For many young activists, the ERA isn't just about legal equality, it's about sending a message that discrimination has no place in modern America. As of today, the ERA's status is still unresolved. Legal battles continue, with some arguing that the deadline should be removed, and others insisting that the process must start over from scratch. But one thing is very clear. The ERA is far from dead. So why does the Equal Rights Amendment still matter in 2024? After all, critics argue that we already have laws in place to protect against gender discrimination. There's the Equal Pay Act of 1963, Title IX of Education Amendments of 1972, and various provisions of the Civil Rights Act. Isn't that enough? Spoiler, it's not. First, laws can be repealed or weakened. They're subject to the whims of Congress, the courts, and the political climate. A constitutional amendment, on the other hand, is permanent. Well, permanent-ish anyway. It carries a level of authority and stability that no ordinary law can match. Take, for example, the issue of pay equity. Women in the United States still earn about 82 cents for every dollar earned by men. And yes, for the men in the audience who want to start arguing, that is after adjusting for experience, age, and job type. For women of color, that gap is even wider. Without the ERA, lawsuits challenging gender-based pay discrimination are harder to win because the Constitution doesn't explicitly prohibit that discrimination. The ERA would provide a stronger legal foundation for these cases. It would make gender a suspect classification under the law, meaning that any government action that treats people differently based on their sex would face strict scrutiny in court. And the ERA isn't just about women. It's about anyone who's been marginalized because of their gender. Its broad language, which prohibits discrimination on account of sex, could also be used to protect LGBTQ+ individuals. For example, in the landmark 2020 case Bostock versus Clayton County, the Supreme Court ruled that discrimination against LGBTQ+ employees is a form of sex discrimination under the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. The ERA could reinforce this principle, making it even harder for future courts or lawmakers to roll back protections for these Americans. Because, let's face it, we all know that Supreme Court decisions on civil rights aren't exactly written in stone these days. And while we're on that topic, another area where the ERA could have profound impact is reproductive rights. After the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, which overturned Roe v. Wade, the fight for abortion access has become even more urgent. While the ERA wouldn't explicitly guarantee abortion rights, it could provide a stronger legal framework for protecting reproductive freedom. Laws restricting abortion could be challenged as violations of gender equality, arguing that they disproportionately burden women in ways that men don't experience. The ERA could also strengthen protections against gender-based violence. Despite the progress made by laws like the Violence Against Women Act, survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence often face an uphill battle in seeking justice. The ERA would provide a constitutional basis for challenging laws or policies that fail to adequately address violence against women. It would send a clear message that gender-based violence is not just a social issue, it is a violation of constitutional rights. So where does public opinion stand on the ERA today? Well, in one 2023 study, they found that 7 in 10 voters supported the ERA being placed in the Constitution, with a strong majority, 57%, strongly supporting the ERA, compared to just 12% who oppose it. This includes people across political and demographic lines. But despite this broad support, the ERA remains a polarizing issue in some circles. Critics argue that it's redundant or unnecessary. Others claim it could have unintended consequences. For example, some opponents have argued that the ERA could be used to challenge restrictions on single-sex spaces like bathrooms or sports teams. Those concerns often echo the same fear-mongering tactics that Phyllis Schlafly used in the 70s. But the reality is that the ERA is about fairness. It's about ensuring that everyone, regardless of gender, is treated equally under the law. Ultimately, the ERA's fight is about more than just legal protections. It's about values. What kind of country do we want to be? Do we want to enshrine equality as a fundamental principle, or do we want to continue relying on a patchwork of laws that can be dismantled with the stroke of a pen? I would like to feel hopeful about that. I would like to think that the ERA is a reminder that progress is never linear and that we are all still fighting. But I had too much hope on November 5th, and none at all left on November 6th. So what's the takeaway from all of this? The Equal Rights Amendment is more than just a piece of legislation. It's a symbol in an ongoing fight for gender equality. Its history is a roller coaster of hope, progress, backlash, and resilience. And its future? Well, that's up to us. One of the most remarkable things about the ERA has been its endurance. Think about it. This amendment was first introduced in 1923. That means generations of feminists have fought for it, from the suffragists of the early 20th century to the activists of today. It connects the feminist movement across generations. Alice Paul, who drafted the ERA, once said, "When you put your hand to the plow, you can't put it down until you get to the end of the row." And let me tell you, this row is long. I'm tired. I hope that the next generation wouldn't have to take over the row for me, but they may have to. So here we are, in a post-2024 election world where Trump's victory has emboldened the GOP to double down on anti-woman policies and rhetoric. The ERA's future looks even murkier, but the fight isn't over. It's never over. Here's what needs to happen. Congressional action. Yeah, good luck with that. Congress would need to pass a resolution removing the ratification deadline, allowing the ERA to be certified as the 28th Amendment. But with the GOP controlling Congress and their open hostility towards women's rights, the chances of this happening under the current administration are slim to none. Public pressure. Lawmakers do listen. Sometimes, if you shout loud enough. If enough of us demand the ERA, even the staunchest misogynists might think twice about ignoring us. Yeah, sure. Remember, politicians care about staying in power. If it becomes politically dangerous for them to oppose gender equality, we can force their hand. But it's going to take a lot more action than we had in the 2024 election season to get that done. And legal challenges. The courts could be ultimately where the ERA's fate is decided. Advocates have continued to push lawsuits arguing that the deadline should be invalid and that the ERA has already met the constitutional requirements to be ratified. But with Trump's judicial appointees littering the courts, this route is anything but straightforward. But let's get real. The ERA doesn't just need legal strategies. It needs a cultural movement. It needs people to care. That's where we come in. Right now, you're listening to this podcast, and maybe you're wondering, is the ERA purely symbolic? Would it even change anything? And that's a valid question, especially when we've seen the 14th Amendment bent, twisted, and warped to justify some of the most regressive policies of our time. But here's the thing. Symbols do matter. Constitutional amendments matter. They are more than just words. They are declarations of our values as a society. Right now, the U.S. Constitution does not explicitly guarantee gender equality. Let that sink in. The document that defines our democracy, the blueprint for justice, does not include half the population in its basic promise of equality. Should we be shocked, given that it was written by a room full of white men who didn't even believe women should be able to vote? No. But should we accept it in 2024? Absolutely not. Frankly, I think it's time to scandalize Thomas Jefferson's dusty old bones by demanding a real, explicit promise of equality for women in the Constitution. If nothing else, let's make the Founding Fathers roll in their graves by making the future more equitable than they could have ever imagined. If you're fired up about the ERA, and I hope you are, there are ways to get involved. Call your representatives and senators. Tell them you support the ERA and that you want them to take action. Donate to organizations working on gender equality. Share this episode with your friends, your family, and your coworkers. Basically, anyone that will listen. And if someone tries to tell you that the ERA is outdated or unnecessary, hit them with the facts. Equality doesn't have a deadline, progress doesn't expire, and the fight for justice is never over. And that's it for today's episode of Bitchy History. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend, or better yet, share it with someone who thinks feminism is a dirty word. I like starting fights. Until next time, stay informed, stay fired up, and remember, when a mediocre white man calls you a bitch, take it as a compliment. They hate it when you do that. Thank you for tuning in to hear me bitch about history. If you're loving the show, don't forget to subscribe and make sure to visit bitchyhistory.com to sign up for the newsletter. The newsletter offers extra resources on the topics covered in all of our episodes, as well as on the topics covered in my videos on TikTok. Supporting the podcast is really easy. Spread the word to your friends, grab some fabulous Bitchy History merch off our website, or consider becoming a paid subscriber. Your support means the world to us.
History.
History. History. History.
History.
What a bitch, right?